Avril de 1943, 20 mil pays so brief Flandres, Belgica, 11 H-47. Lieutenant Franz Stigler banked his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 to the left and squinted through the oil-stained glass of his canopy, observing something he had never seen before cutting through the pale blue sky of occupied Europe. It was fat. Absurdly fat. A squat and disproportionate silhouette that seemed to defy all the laws of aerodynamics he had learned at Luftwaffe flight school. The other German pilots in his staffel were already laughing over the radio, their voices crackling through the static with barely contained mockery. "Milchflash," someone shouted, "milk bottle," and the nickname caught on instantly, spreading across Luftwaffe frequencies like fire through dry paper. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, making its awkward debut in European skies, looked anything but a warrior. At 7 tons gross weight, it was heavier than some light bombers, its cylindrical fuselage and enormous nose making it the target of immediate ridicule among German aces who had danced through the skies against sleek Spitfires and nimble Hurricanes. Stigler watched the American approaching in formation with 5 other Thunderbolts, their thick wings and bulky profile making them look like awkward ducks on a lake of swans. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the familiar roar of the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine responding beneath his hands, and began his approach. It would be easy. It was always easy when the Americans arrived with their shiny new machines, inexperienced pilots trying to look confident while their fingers trembled on the control sticks. Stigler had 17 victories painted on the vertical stabilizer of his 109, each black swastika representing an Allied aircraft he had sent spinning in flames to the earth below. Number 18 would be just one more. But when he closed to 400 meters, something changed. The lead P-47, that damn fat one, didn't run, didn't panic. Instead, it turned directly towards Stigler with a confidence that froze something in the German's chest. And then the world exploded in tracers. 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, mounted in each wing of the Thunderbolt, opened fire simultaneously, and what Stigler saw was not a burst of shots, but a solid wall of lead and white phosphorus tearing through the air between them. These weren't bullets, it was an incandescent river of destruction, 3,400 rounds feeding those hungry weapons, each spitting 800 projectiles per minute, creating a density of fire no German pilot had encountered before. Stigler threw his stick to the right so hard his muscles screamed, the negative G making his stomach rise to his throat as orange-red tracers passed centimeters from his canopy, so close he could feel the heat through the perspex. His radio exploded in screams. "Raus! Raus! Raus! Get out! Get out! Get out!" But it was too late for Oberleutnant Dieter Koch, whose 109 disintegrated instantly when the torrent of .50 fire cut through his right wing like a saw through cardboard. Koch's plane spun violently, a smoky and pathetic spiral, and Stigler saw the white parachute blossom seconds before diving his own aircraft in a desperate dive for the cloud cover below. His heart was pounding like a jackhammer. His hands were shaking. And for the first time in 18 months of combat, Franz Stigler, Luftwaffe ace, Iron Cross winner, terror of the Allied skies, felt something he had never expected to feel, absolute and primitive fear. The milk bottle had just shown its fangs, and the sky over Europe would never be the same again. The transformation of the P-47 Thunderbolt from flying joke to angel of death began not in the skies, but on the drafting tables and wind tunnels of Republic Aviation Corporation in Farmingdale, New York, where engineers led by Alexander Kartveli faced a seemingly impossible problem in late 1940. The United States Army Air Force wanted a fighter that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, survive brutal punishment, dominate at high altitudes, and carry enough armament to destroy anything in the sky, all while outperforming the best fighters from Germany and Japan. It was a wish list that violated all known rules of aircraft design. Fighters were supposed to be light, agile, minimalist, deadly dancers built around engines and guns, with everything else being wasted weight. But Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant with a doctorate in engineering and a stubbornness that rivaled any general, rejected conventional wisdom completely. If the army wanted a fighter that did everything, then he would build exactly that, and to hell with elegance. The heart of the design was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial monster that produced 2,000 horsepower, more brute force than any fighter in service possessed. But power meant nothing at combat altitude without a turbocharger, and this is where the P-47 became truly revolutionary. Cartvelli installed a General Electric CH-5 turbo supercharger in the rear fuselage, connected to the engine by ducts running under the cockpit, creating a system that could force dense air into the cylinders even at 30,000 feet, where the air was too thin to sustain normal combustion. It was brilliant engineering, but it came at a cost. The ducts added weight. The armor added weight. The self-sealing fuel tanks, designed after horrific reports from Europe showing pilots burning alive when bullets pierced their tanks, added more weight. The 8.50 machine guns, each carrying over 400 rounds, added hundreds of pounds. When the first XP-47B rolled out of the factory in May 1941, it weighed 12,700 pounds fully loaded, almost twice the weight of a Spitfire MKV. Test pilots shook their heads in disbelief. It looked like a barrel with wings. It moved like an elephant on the ground. And when Lowry Brabham made the first flight on May 6, 1941, he returned with mixed reports. It climbed like a murderer and dove like a stone, but turned like a cargo ship and accelerated like molasses in winter. The Air Force looked at the specifications, looked at the airplane, and began production anyway, because they had no choice. The war in Europe was devouring aircraft faster than factories could produce them, and any fighter was better than no fighter. But when the first P-47CS arrived in England in the spring of 1943, assigned to the 56th, 78th and 4th Fighter Groups, the reaction from combat pilots was something between horror and revulsion. They had flown P-40s and P-39s, relatively light fighters that responded to delicate touches and could maneuver with anything in the sky. The Thunderbolt didn't respond. It reflected, slowly and lazily, like a hungover teenager. Captain Robert S. Johnson, a 22-year-old pilot from the 61st Fighter Squadron, later recalled his first impression. "I thought they gave us a bomber by mistake. The damn thing was so big, I was sure the Germans would see us from Berlin." Veteran pilots who had survived the Spitfire deserted to RAF units whenever possible. Morale plummeted. And then came April 17, 1943, the mission that was supposed to prove the P-47's worth, but almost buried its reputation completely. The mission was simple on paper. Escort B-17 bombers from the 8th Air Force in an attack against industrial facilities in Bremen, Germany. 54 P-47 Thunderbolts took off from bases in England. There are 2,800 engines roaring across the snowy field as they climbed into formation. Pilots checking instruments and testing weapons as they grouped around the massive flying fortresses slowly crawling through the cold morning air. At 15,000 feet, everything seemed routine, just another escort mission, just another day of trying not to die. But at 20,000 feet, as they crossed into German-controlled airspace, things began to fall apart. The radio stayed too silent. The bomber formations seemed too exposed. And then, from nowhere, dozens of black dots materialized against the gray-blue sky. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs pouring out of the clouds like enraged wasps, diving in coordinated attacks that shattered the American formation in seconds. The German pilots flew straight through the Thunderbolts as if they weren't there, targeting the vulnerable bombers with the precision of surgeons, and the P-47s, those heavy, awkward monsters, simply couldn't react fast enough. American pilots pulled their sticks so hard the aircraft frames groaned, trying to turn inside the smaller, more agile 109s, but physics worked against them cruelly. The P-47 needed space to maneuver, higher altitudes to take advantage of its diving power, time to accelerate to speeds where its mass became an advantage instead of a liability. But there, trapped in mid-altitude turning combat against some of the most experienced pilots in the world, the Thunderbolt was a fat, slow target. Lieutenant Quince Brown from the 78th Group saw his wingman disappear in a fireball when 20mm cannons tore through his cockpit. Major David Schilling fought desperately against 3 FW-190s simultaneously, screaming on the radio for support that never came, finally escaping only because he dove so violently that his aircraft reached speeds that would have torn the wings off any German fighter. 5 P-47s didn't return. 6 returned so damaged they were written off as losses. The bombers lost 18 B-17s. And when the surviving pilots dragged themselves out of their cockpits back at English bases, their flight suits soaked with sweat despite the freezing cold, The words they used to describe the P-47 couldn't be printed in family newspapers. But here was the truth no one yet understood, the reality that would only reveal itself through blood and time. The P-47 wasn't designed to fight like a Spitfire. It wasn't built for turning dogfights where agility won. It was designed for an entirely different war, a vertical war of crushing speed and devastating firepower, where altitude meant life and high-speed dives transformed 7 tons of American steel into an unstoppable missile. The pilots just needed to learn to fight differently. And among those who would learn fastest was Robert Johnson, an Oklahoma farmer who would become one of the P-47's greatest legends, a man who would survive the impossible and prove that that fat milk bottle could swallow punishment that would destroy any other fighter in the sky. June 26, 1943, approximately 25,000 feet over occupied France, 2:12 p.m. Robert Johnson was dying, and he knew it with the crystal clarity that only comes when every second might be your last. His P-47, nicknamed All Hell, was shredded. A Focke-Wulf 190 piloted by Oberleutnant Egon Mayer, one of the Luftwaffe's deadliest aces, had appeared from the sun like a vengeful ghost and unloaded cannons and machine guns into Johnson's Thunderbolt with surgical precision. The canopy exploded into shards. The windscreen disintegrated into 1,000 cutting fragments. 20mm projectiles pierced the fuselage like fists through paper, cutting hydraulic lines, tearing off pieces of wing, transforming the cockpit into a slaughterhouse of twisted metal and exposed electrical wires. Johnson's blood splattered against what remained of his instruments. A metal fragment had opened his scalp, another had torn his thigh, and he could barely see through the combination of blood and freezing wind howling through the destroyed cockpit. His radio was dead. His controls responded as if swimming through molasses. Oil pressure was dropping, and Mayer, that methodical and relentless son of a bitch, was coming back for the killing blow, his FW-190 turning in a graceful arc to line up for another pass. Johnson pulled the stick back with every ounce of strength he possessed, fighting to keep all hell level while his AR-2800 engine coughed and vibrated, oil spreading across what remained of his windscreen. He tried to open the canopy to bail out, standard procedure when your aircraft was doomed, but the hydraulic mechanisms were dead, and the canopy, deformed by cannon impacts, was stuck. He was trapped inside a flying coffin slowly falling from the sky. Mayer approached again, and Johnson saw the orange flashes of the 190's weapons light up, tracers converging in his direction like accusing fingers of fire. More impacts. The P-47's tail shuddered violently. Something exploded near the engine, and white-blue flames licked the edge of the cowling. It was over. Johnson closed his eyes, waiting for darkness. But darkness didn't come. Instead came silence, the sudden and confusing silence of weapons that no longer fired. Johnson opened his eyes and saw Mayer's FW-190 floating beside him, so close he could see the German pilot's face through the perspex. A man about 30 years old, thin mustache, expression of total disbelief. Mayer was looking at the P-47 as if seeing a ghost. He had poured hundreds of projectiles into the Thunderbolt. He had hit over 200 times. And somehow, impossibly and inexplicably, the damn American airplane was still flying. Johnson's frame was riddled with holes so large you could stick your fist through them. His tail looked like Swiss cheese. Half of his left wing was missing. But the AR-2800 engine, that crude and over-engineered American beast, kept turning, coughing and smoking but refusing to die. And the fuselage, that fat and ridiculed design the Germans had mocked, proved to be a colossus of redundant components, heavy armor, and engineering that prioritized survival over elegance. For a long moment, Mayer simply flew alongside Johnson, as if trying to understand what he was seeing. Then, surprisingly, the German ace waggled his wings, a pilot-to-pilot salute, an acknowledgement of courage or perhaps simply shock at the durability of the American aircraft, and pulled away, probably out of ammunition, possibly just respecting a man who should be dead but refused to fall. Johnson fought with all hell for another 45 minutes of agony, crossing the English Channel at 3,000 feet, constantly losing altitude, his engine finally bursting into flames as he passed over the English coast. He hit an RAF emergency runway at Manston, making a belly landing that scraped another 30 feet of metal from the P-47's fuselage, and when he finally managed to crawl out of the smoking wreck, the ground crew who ran to help him simply stopped and stared in amazement. An RAF sergeant counted the bullet holes aloud, 198, 199, 200, before giving up because there were too many to count. An American mechanic looked at the shattered tail and muttered, "My God, they must have shot you with everything but the kitchen sink." Johnson, covered in blood and still shaking from adrenaline, looked at the wreckage of his P-47 and said something that would become legendary. "That fat son of a bitch brought me home. I knew he would." The story spread through 8th Air Force bases like electricity. Pilots who had cursed the P-47 began to see it differently. Maybe it wasn't a dancer. Maybe it was heavy and awkward and difficult to maneuver. But when the bullets started flying, when you were alone over enemy territory with half the Luftwaffe trying to kill you, those 7 tons of American steel meant the difference between going home and burning in a French crater. And as 1943 progressed into summer and fall, as more missions were flown and more pilots survived the impossible inside their indestructible Thunderbolts, the Air Force began to understand what they really had. And the Germans, those same pilots who had laughed at the fat milk bottle, began to learn a terrible lesson about underestimating American engineering. The Luftwaffe's transformation from confidence to terror didn't happen in a single dramatic moment, but through 1,000 small horrors that accumulated like water filling a sinking ship, each incident adding more weight until panic became inevitable. It began in late 1943, when Republic began delivering P-47s equipped with a new Curtiss electric 4-blade propeller, a modification that seemed minor on paper but fundamentally changed the physics of combat. The early Thunderbolts had used 3-blade propellers that limited their acceleration and rate of climb, making them predictable in combat. But the new 4-blade props transformed the P-47 into something different, something that violated everything German pilots had learned about fighting the American aircraft. Lieutenant Hans Hartigs of Jägerschwader 26, veteran of 89 combat missions, wrote in his diary in November 1943, "The Thunderbolts have changed. I don't know how or why, but they climb faster now, turn tighter, and when they dive on you, it's like being chased by Valkyries. 8 heavy machine guns all firing at once create a sound you hear in your bones. Becker was hit yesterday. A 2-second burst cut his wing clean off. 2 seconds. The plane just disintegrated. We used to laugh at them. Nobody's laughing now." The change in tactics was also killing the Luftwaffe. American pilots finally understood how to fight vertically, using altitude as currency and transforming every engagement into a series of high-speed dives where the P-47's weight became a weapon. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, codified this into doctrine. Never try to turn with a 109 or 190 at low altitude. Instead, maintain altitude, dive at speeds above 400 miles per hour where no German fighter can follow without their wings coming off. Make one pass with those 8.50s spitting 100 rounds per second combined. Then climb back up using momentum and repeat. It was fighting as applied physics, transforming aerial combat from art into science, and it was working with lethal efficiency. By December 1943, the 56th Group's P-47s alone had destroyed 97 Luftwaffe aircraft against 23 losses, a kill ratio that would have been impossible just 6 months earlier. But the real terror came when the 8th Air Force authorized P-47s to conduct ground attack missions after escorting bombers, turning the Thunderbolts loose against Germany's transportation infrastructure. And here, in this new role as fighter bomber, the P-47 transformed from fearsome into apocalyptic. The 8.50 machine guns, loaded with armor-piercing, incendiary, and explosive ammunition, could destroy virtually anything that wasn't a fortified concrete bunker. Trains, the trains that moved troops, tanks, fuel, and ammunition across occupied Europe, were especially vulnerable. A stationary train was an easy target. A moving train was an exciting target. And when 4 P-47s dove from 10,000 feet on a German rail convoy, each aircraft spitting 3,400 rounds, the result wasn't combat, it was extermination. Tracers pierced locomotive boilers, which exploded in eruptions of superheated steam. Incendiary rounds ignited cargo cars loaded with ammunition, creating secondary explosions that launched debris hundreds of meters into the air. Fuel tank cars became rolling fireballs that transformed miles of track into infernos. The mission logs from January 1944 tell the story in dry bureaucratic language that can't hide the carnage. Railway cars destroyed, 1,247. Locomotives destroyed, 89. Secondary targets included marshalling yard facilities, railway bridges, and troop concentrations. Translation: thousands of German soldiers killed, hundreds of tons of supplies destroyed, the entire logistics network that kept the Wehrmacht functioning being systematically torn apart by aircraft that had been ridiculed as useless just a year before. Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, commander of all Luftwaffe fighter forces and one of Germany's greatest aces with 104 victories, wrote in his post-war memoirs with barely disguised bitterness, "We made a terrible mistake with the Thunderbolt. We saw its appearance and assumed it would be easy. But the Americans don't design aircraft to look beautiful, they design them to function." And the P-47 functioned. Its heavy machine guns could bring down our fighters at distances where our weapons didn't reach. Its engine could absorb damage that would have brought down 3 Messerschmitts. And when they began attacking our supply lines, we realized we had no defense. A single Thunderbolt could destroy more in 15 minutes of ground attack than an entire squadron of medium bombers. Multiply that by hundreds of sorties per day, and you understand why we lost the air war before we lost it on the ground. The numbers support his assessment. In 1944, as American production accelerated and more P-47s flooded Europe, the destruction statistics became almost impossible to believe. By the end of the war, Thunderbolts had destroyed or damaged 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks, 3,752 Luftwaffe aircraft in aerial combat, 3,315 aircraft destroyed on the ground during airfield attacks, hundreds of bridges, thousands of military buildings, and countless Axis soldiers whose deaths were never officially tallied because they happened on French country roads or Polish railway crossings where no one was keeping records. Robert Johnson himself, that Oklahoma farmer who survived 200 bullet holes, finished the war with 28 victories and a crystalline understanding of what the P-47 represented. It wasn't the prettiest fighter. It wasn't the fastest or the most maneuverable. But it was the toughest. It could take a beating that would kill anything else in the sky and still bring you home. And when you squeezed those triggers and felt those 850s roaring, when you saw your tracers converging on a target and watched the destruction they caused, you knew you were flying something special. The Germans learned to fear us not because we were better pilots. Many of them were more experienced than us, but because our aircraft could absorb punishment, dish out punishment, and keep coming back, day after day, wave after wave, until there simply was no more Luftwaffe. And that, finally, was the true lesson of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the truth that transformed mocking laughter into existential terror. It didn't matter how brilliant German tactics were or how brave their pilots were, they couldn't defeat American industrial logic. The United States built 15,683 Thunderbolts between 1942 and 1945, an average of almost 10 per day, every day, for 3.5 consecutive years. Each carried half a ton of machine guns and 3/4 of a ton of ammunition. Each could absorb damage that would destroy 2 or 3 German fighters. And each was piloted by men who knew that if they were shot down, another P-47 would take their place the next day, because that's what mass production meant, that's what industrial power meant, that's how bourgeois capitalist democracies fight fascist dictatorships, not with tactical mastery, but with the crushing and relentless weight of machines that simply refused to stop coming. In May 1945, when the last P-47s flew their final missions over a defeated Germany, when surviving German pilots crawled out of their hiding places and surrendered to the Allies, many of them mentioned the Thunderbolt in interrogations with a mixture of respect and something close to trauma. They had begun the war laughing at the fat milk bottle. They ended with Jabo fever, psychological panic at the mere sound of our 2,800 engines roaring overhead, because they had learned the hardest way that underestimating American engineering, ridiculing the American preference for weight over elegance, mocking aircraft that prioritized survival and firepower over agility, was a mistake you only made once, because the second time, those 8.50 caliber machine guns would ensure there was no third time, would ensure you became just another statistic in the mission logs. Just another target destroyed by an aircraft that transformed mockery into legend and proved that sometimes, just sometimes, 7 tons of American lead and fury flying at 400 miles per hour is exactly the right answer to the question nobody had thought to ask.